One of the most interesting things happening in watches right now has almost nothing to do with watchmaking. What I'm referring to is the recent collaboration between Audemars Piguet and Swatch, and the response to it has been massive. Social media exploded. There were insane lines out front of all the Swatch stores. People debated it endlessly. I saw all sorts of mock-ups. We had some collectors that loved it. Some collectors hated it. Some people bought it because they genuinely thought it was fun. And others bought it because hype itself has infiltrated the luxury watch ecosystem and we have to stamp it out. And, and honestly, at the end of the day, I do think there's something positive about what is happening. To me, anything that gets younger people interested in watches is probably good for the hobby overall. We have to remember that excitement around watchmaking and watches in general matters. The enthusiasm, the curiosity, it all matters. And at the same time, if I'm being perfectly honest with you, I would never buy one. Not because I'm angry about it, not because I think these collaborations that keep happening are ruining the watch industry somehow. And it's not because I think the people who buy them are wrong for liking them. But it's simply because what draws me into watches has never really been the hype. What keeps me fascinated in this hobby is the craftsmanship, the engineering, the finishing, design, the mechanical artistry of it. That feeling that you're interacting with something that required an extraordinary amount of either machine or human skill to create. And that is what I want to talk about today as it relates to Audemars Piguet. Because, again, the collaboration itself isn't really the interesting story to me personally. I think the interesting story is the actual watchmaker behind the logo on this new collab. So we're going to talk a little bit about today, why does Audemars Piguet actually matter? Why is it considered part of the holy trinity of watchmaking? You've heard that term. What did the company actually do to earn that level of respect? And in a world that's dominated by hype, does AP still deserve genuine admiration from serious watch enthusiasts like y'all watching? And then along the way, of course, I'll also talk about some of my favorite modern AP pieces. So we're going to talk about the Royal Oak Jumbo. We're going to talk about the Royal Oak Flying Tourbillon, which I love, and the AP Code 1159, which has been hated, but I actually really, really like. So we're going to talk about those three. And I think regardless of how you feel about modern watch culture, these watches represent an astonishing level of craftsmanship, and that's the distinction that you need to know about because that is what matters with AP. So my name is James. I'm a watch collector, I'm a watch enthusiast, and I'm a watch advisor, and I am all about you coming to know and love your watches. So thanks for stopping by. Please like the video and subscribe to my channel. You'll see new stuff every week. And check out the description below where I have a lot more content for you. Now as we get going, we've got to do our weekly wrist check here. And this week I am wearing my Omega Seamaster 1200 meter Plo Prof in summer blue on the shark mesh bracelet. It's a heavy monster of a piece, but it's actually very wearable and continues to be a really fun travel and everyday watch for me. So before we even discuss the Royal Oak, we need to understand something that's important about Audemars Piguet as a brand. This is not a brand that became prestigious because celebrities were wearing it. That's the truth. In many ways, it's exactly the opposite of that. Celebrities wear AP because the company had already established itself as one of the great names in horology long before modern luxury hype culture even existed. So just to give a brief history, Audemars Piguet was founded in 1875 in Les Brassus in the Vallée de Joux region of Switzerland, where many other brands can be found. And if you spend enough time studying watchmaking history, you'll realize that the Vallée de Joux is almost mythical in terms of mechanical watch development. There have been so many different companies and brands that have come from there. This region became home to some of the most technically advanced watchmaking ever created. Things like perpetual calendars, minute repeaters, ultra-thin watches, chronographs, and just wild, wild complications. And AP really became one of the companies most associated with that high level of traditional horology. And when people refer to the holy trinity of watchmaking, they're typically talking about these three brands. It's going to be Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, and Audemars Piguet. Now, technically, this is not some official organization. There's nothing that says that this is the three. But the reason these three brands are grouped together is because they consistently represented a few key things within watchmaking. We're talking about elite movement finishing. There's technical sophistication there. There's some level of historical importance. You have hand craftsmanship. And the watchmaking itself is artistic. And that's a hugely important expression of what goes on in watchmaking. And AP absolutely earned the position that it holds in the Holy Trinity, not through marketing, but through the execution that it's been delivering time after time after time in its watches. Something that I think that modern collectors sometimes forget is that AP was already producing extraordinary watches before the Royal Oak ever existed. So long before integrated bracelet sports watches became internet status symbols, Audemars Piguet was making ultra complicated watches at a level that very few brands could approach, honestly. And one of the things that separates traditional high horology from mainstream luxury is the amount of hand work involved. So like when you look at a high-end AP movement under magnification, you start noticing details that are almost irrationally obsessive. The bevels are so flawless, finished by hand. The interior angles, all polished by hand. Black polished steel components that reflect light at specific angles. You have Côte de Genève that is perfectly executed, mirror polished screw heads. Even areas of the movement that you'll never see are actually decorated. And what's fascinating is that many of these techniques are very inefficient, honestly. Like modern machines can create something that look close enough from a distance, but hand finishing just creates those surfaces that interact with light so much differently. So you have these edges that become softer, they become richer, the transitions between components become kind of more organic, and the movement starts to look actually less industrial and more sculptural in a way. And again, AP became known for that level of refinement, not because it was practical, but because it represented the mastery that they have achieved over watchmaking. Then in 1972, everything changed because the Swiss watch industry was under enormous pressure from the quartz crisis. And into that environment, AP released one of the most important watches ever made. You can disagree with me on this, but I believe it to be true, and that is the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Jumbo Extra Thin. And you all probably heard the name of the designer of that watch. This was the one that was designed by Gerald Genta. And now today, because the Royal Oak is so associated with hype culture, celebrity culture, social media flexing culture, I do think that people sometimes lose sight of how genuinely revolutionary this watch was at the time. This was a luxury steel sports watch priced like a precious metal watch. At the time, and honestly even still today in a lot of respects, that was pretty insane. But again, the brilliance of this was not because it was stainless steel. The brilliance was in the execution of what they were doing to these watches. The integrated bracelet alone was astonishing. And honestly, I don't know that people fully appreciate how difficult integrated bracelet watch finishing actually is. On a traditional strap watch, if you look at a normal watch on a strap, the bracelet or strap is completely separate from the case. You just polish the case by itself. On an integrated bracelet watch, the case and the bracelet become one continuous visual structure. And you can see that on, again, a lot of different models now. Not only the Royal Oak, but you have the Nautilus from Patek Philippe. You have the Locomotive now from Crador, so many others. And that means that every brush surface, every polished bevel, every transitional angle has to flow perfectly across the entire watch. And again, AP executes this at an absurd level. Even today, the finishing on the Royal Oak bracelet, though imitated by many, is still among the best in the entire watch industry. The brushing, if you look at one of these watches, the brushing is incredibly fine. It's all done in the same direction. The polished bevels along the sides of the watch are unbelievably crisp. And then there's the craftsmanship detail that absolutely blows my mind. Many of the bracelet links are individually hand finished before they're assembled. So just look at a Royal Oak bracelet, look at how many intermediary links there are to connect the main links, and just think about how much work it is to manually polish and hand finish every single one of those links. You've got to also, while you're doing that, be able to maintain perfect geometry and consistency of the finishing while still articulating smoothly when it's actually on your wrist. Now, again, that is not fashion manufacturing like this most recent collab. That's serious watchmaking craftsmanship. And I would defy anyone to debate me on this because you just have to look at one. If you've not seen one in the hand, they're incredible. Now, let's talk about some of my favorite modern AP watches because this matters. They're still relevant with the watchmaking side of things, not just the hype. This channel is not about that. We don't talk about that here. So let's focus on the watches themselves. And the first one is the AP Royal Oak Jumbo Extra Thin. Now, this watch, again, it's iconic because of the fact that it kind of lives spiritually through the decades since the first model was made. To me, this watch represents restraint in a weird way. And that's part of why I love it. It's thin, it's elegant, it's very balanced, which I appreciate. It is architectural at the same time, and the proportions on this are incredible. So if we're looking at the more recent, like modern version of this, you have a 39 millimeter case with an 8.1 millimeter thickness. So just think about that. We've seen some incredible releases this year from different brands, JLC being one of my personal favorites, and then you have the Royal Oak Jumbo still coming in at like 8 millimeters thick. That's amazing. And of course, for me, the blue dial version in particular is stunning because AP's tapisserie dial has extraordinary dimensionality. It's just very three-dimensional, and it's pretty amazing. So the dial is not stamped in some simplistic way. The petite tapisserie pattern is actually created using an old-fashioned pantograph style machine, and that's what traces the master pattern mechanically. These machines are decades old, in some cases over 100 years, and very few people even know how to operate them properly anymore. So that's pretty incredible. Then the result that you get on the dial is this texture with a lot of depth, a lot of sharpness, and it's really hard to replicate it authentically. So that's just the dial. Then you have the movement. And now the modern Jumbo uses an ultra-thin automatic caliber with finishing that is remarkable under magnification. So it's the caliber 7121. And ultra-thin watchmaking in itself is one of the hardest disciplines in horology. Because when you reduce thickness on a watch movement, the tolerances have to be tighter. The rigidity of the actual metal becomes a lot harder to maintain. Shock resistance becomes more difficult, and the assembly gets incrementally more complicated as you go thinner. And thinness in watchmaking is not simplicity. It's definitely an element of sophistication from AP. And the Royal Oak Jumbo wears almost more like an industrial sculpture than a watch. It's one of the very few watches where the bracelet genuinely feels like part of the artistic identity of the watch itself. And again, if you've ever seen one, had one, worn one on the wrist, I think you'll understand what I'm talking about. Now, we are going to move into something even more dramatic, and I absolutely love these watches. They are just stunning. We're going to talk a little bit about the Audemars Piguet Royal Oak Flying Tourbillon models. Now, there are a lot of these different models out there. Everything from kind of just your standard like jumbo model with a tourbillon on it to like limited edition with some really cool like smoked dials, like fume kind of fade to the dials, to just really ridiculous stuff like precious metals, gem setting, all sorts of insane things. So to me, this watch is fascinating because it combines that like brutalist angular identity of the Royal Oak with one of the most delicate complications in all of watchmaking, and that is the flying tourbillon. So originally, tourbillons were invented to counteract positional timing error, and this is back in the days of like pocket watches. But today, they're mostly just artistic demonstrations of watchmaking capability, and AP's execution, once again, is incredible. There's a lot of different brands out there that make flying tourbillons. I shouldn't say a lot. There are plenty of brands out there that make flying tourbillons. AP has just such a great look to their flying tourbillons. Even brands that make really good looking tourbillons that aren't flying, meaning that they actually have a bridge connecting them or mounting them in the front essentially, they still don't look as good as AP's flying tourbillon. They just look so awesome. So the tourbillon cage itself, of course, is super lightweight, super precise. In many cases, they weigh fractions of a gram. And think about the precision required to have a rotating escapement assembly operating continuously with that level of refinement to it. It's unbelievable. And the really astonishing thing is the hand finishing inside of these watches. So collectors, again, often talk about hand finishing in kind of vague terms. We're not very specific when we describe these things. But let's be specific for a second. Some of the internal bevels on AP high complication movements are polished using wooden pegs and abrasive compounds entirely by hand. This is like your classic, Geneva seal or like just very high-end finishing. So it's not automated. There's no CNC finishing. It's all done by hand. And then certain internal angles literally cannot be replicated by machine finishing because a machine tool physically can't reach the geometry in the proper way. So it has to be done by hand. That is one of the signs that collectors look for when you talk about elite finishing. Just really, really sharp interior angles. Those often are an indication of genuine hand craftsmanship. So take that, and then now we add skeletonization to the watches. So you start removing material from bridges that would normally be to create durability and structure, and now you're removing material while maintaining that same level of integrity. That's incredibly hard to do. So you're balancing out in a single movement the aesthetics, the rigidity, the tolerances, good-looking finishing, and the reliability of the movement, because that's also important. And AP's skeletonized work often looks almost architectural, especially some of the open work dials with like double balances in them. Just unbelievable. It's like mechanical lace work, basically. Now we're going to move on to the controversial one of the three that we're going to mention today, and that is the Audemars Piguet Code 1159 self-winding. And I got to be honest, I think this watch is deeply underrated. I've heard different things from different collectors about the movements in these, so I'm not going to comment on that. But I do think when you talk about the Code 1159, part of the problem with that model line and why it didn't really do well out of the gate and still is not doing as well as it could is AP collectors wanted another Royal Oak. They just did. That's what they're used to, and that's what they were looking for. And instead, AP tried to do something very different. And anytime you try to do that with such a well-established model line, there's a risk to that. There just is. And so the case architecture on the code 1159, when you really look at it closely, is pretty astonishing. From a distance, it looks kind of simple. You're like, okay, this is just another watch with like a steel case. Or obviously they make precious metals as well. But they actually have this mid case that's octagonal, and it's suspended inside the round outer case structure. So there's a lot of compound components to this case. The lugs themselves are partially hollowed out, which is, again, extremely difficult to machine and to finish. And then when you look at the surfaces and the transitions between the satin brushing and the polishing, there's so much complexity there. There's a lot that's going on. Then you have the crystal too. So the crystal itself is difficult to manufacture because it curves in multiple directions simultaneously. You can kind of see this if you look at an AP code 1159 crystal. It's not just domed. It has this kind of double curve geometry that creates distortion and plays with the light a bit across the dial in a very unusual way. And that level of sapphire manufacturing is extremely expensive and technically challenging too. So there's just so much going on there. Then you look at the dial, and the blue fume style execution has incredible depth. There are these kind of concentric circle patterns on some of the models that just look awesome. And then they also use PVD, or physical vapor deposition techniques, combined with layering, to create a really rich tonal transition that change dramatically depending on the lighting once again. So that's all just on the outside. And then inside, the movement finishing, again, remains very exceptional here. So even though the code 1159 receives a lot less hype than the Royal Oak, AP did not at all reduce the level of craftsmanship with this watch. And honestly, I respect that a lot. They could have easily just reduced the quality, produced endless Royal Oak variations forever, but instead they said, we're going to try something different with the 1159. And in my opinion, even though, again, it's not as popular, I do still think it's a success because they are excellent watches. One thing that I have learned over time in this hobby is that genuine quality becomes more impressive the longer you collect. So at first, people often focus on, again, things like the brand name, the hype, the resale value, the maybe internet visibility that you get by owning a certain watch. But eventually you start paying attention to different things. You start to look at how smoothly the bracelet articulates on your wrist. You look at how sharp the transitions are. You look at how the light interacts with the beveling on the case. You look at how precisely the hands align, how refined the texture feels, how balanced the proportions are when it's on your wrist. And AP excels in all of those details. And to me, that is the difference between hype and craftsmanship. Hype creates urgency. That's what it does. Craftsmanship creates that long-term appreciation that allows brands to really stand out across time. And I think that distinction matters enormously for collectors who are trying to build satisfying collections. Because I got to tell you, hype fades away pretty quick. With all these launches, this AP Swatch collab thing, it was insane. The hype is lessened. Of course, all the resellers are there. But hype fades away. It just does. But when you have quality that's consistent over time, that tends to age very, very well. Now let me be clear about this, because I got to make sure that I'm direct here. There's absolutely nothing wrong with enjoying watches as fashion. Watches have always had a fashion component to them. In a lot of ways, the watches that we know and love are some shape of fashion. They just are. It's art on the wrist, whether you look at just the bracelet, whether you look at the bracelet, the case, the dial, all the components kind of together. But watches have always had a fashion component to them, even historically. And there's really only a problem when fashion starts to completely replace the appreciation for the craftsmanship that's there. And that is the main reason why the AP and Swatch release does not personally resonate with me. Again, it's not because it's evil, it's not because they're doing something offensive, but because to me it's fundamentally aimed at a different kind of enjoyment. It's just about cultural excitement, accessibility, which unfortunately now, all the resellers are going to make harder. It's about the fun and the novelty of it. And those things are totally fine. But when I think about Audemars Piguet, I think about all the things that we talked about, right? Hand finishing, movement architecture, ultra thin engineering, the bracelet artistry, complications, and what they have done, truly decades of horological innovation across time. Those are the things that I connect with emotionally and the reasons why I appreciate AP. And honestly, I think this is one of the most important lessons in collecting overall. Again, you do not need hype to enjoy your watches deeply. You just don't. Some of the most satisfying moments in collecting happen quietly. There's this guy I follow on TikTok. I think his name is Daniel. And he is the most excited about going to stores and finding these very inexpensive quartz, watches. And this guy just has such a passion for what he does with watches that it's super fun for me to just watch his stuff. I don't watch a ton of watch content. I watch some, but I love watching his stuff. And it's because of the fact that the passion is there. I have a friend of mine that is super into Pokemon. And this guy just found some Seiko Pokemon watches and just thinks they're the coolest thing in the world. And to me, that is what passion and enjoyment for watches really means. For myself, right? Anytime I go anywhere, even if there are watches that I don't think that I would buy, just the experience of looking at them, seeing them in a case, having a representative pull one out and have me try it on, just feeling the bracelet, the heft of the case, watching the movement do its thing on the dial to produce that artistry, those are the things that I connect with the most. So learning the history of a brand, like we talked about today with Audemars Piguet, discovering details that most people never notice. I love having my JLC up close and looking at it through a loop because there's just so much that you see that nobody's going to notice, but I appreciate it. Understanding why certain designs mattered historically. Again, today we talked about the Royal Oak, but we could talk about many others. And appreciating craftsmanship that took literally thousands of hours across years and decades and centuries in some cases, like Vacheron, JLC, some of these other brands. Took thousands of hours to perfect that. That is the side of this hobby that keeps me interested, and I hope it's the side that keeps you interested as well, because long after all the collaborations fade, and long after the internet hype cycles kind of move on, they're all done, long after all the trends change from this dial color to that dial color to this complication to this jumping hour mechanism, after all of that changes and goes away, the actual craftsmanship behind great watchmaking will still be there. And that is why Audemars Piguet matters. So I want to thank you for joining me for this episode. If you enjoy this type of content, definitely take a look at last week's episode where I talk about watch burnout, and I'm hoping that this video will prevent some of you from burning out on AP Swatch collabs because it's just not worth your time. And thank you for being here. I appreciate you all, and I will see you next time. Bye-bye.